It was a super hot summer day in the little town of Oakville. The sun was shining bright, and the air felt sticky, like when you spill juice on your hands and don't wash it off. Kids were playing outside, riding bikes, and eating ice cream that melted too fast. Grown ups sat on porches, fanning themselves with newspapers, trying to stay cool. Oakville was a small place where everyone knew everyone, or at least, they thought they did. In this town, there was a woman named Maya Jackson. If you saw her walking down the street, you might not even notice her. She was quiet, like a mouse sneaking around a kitchen looking for crumbs. She didn't talk much, and she didn't smile a lot either. Maya had dark hair that she tied back in a messy bun, and she always wore plain clothes, old jeans and faded shirts that looked like they'd been washed 100 times. She wasn't loud or fancy, and that's why people didn't pay her much attention. Maya worked all kinds of little jobs around Oakville. Some days, she cleaned offices after everyone went home. She'd push a big mop across the floor, making it shiny and wet, while the lights buzzed above her. Other days, she poured coffee at the tiny diner on Main Street. She'd carry heavy trays of cups and plates, her hands quick and steady, filling up mugs for grumpy truck drivers or sleepy teachers. People saw her working hard, but they didn't think much of it. To them, she was just Maya, the quiet lady who stayed out of the way. But here's the thing, people in Oakville didn't really know Maya. They thought they did, because they saw her every day. They'd say stuff like, "Oh, that's just Maya, sweeping the floors again," or "She's nice, but she doesn't talk much." Sometimes, they'd whisper mean things when she wasn't looking. "She doesn't fit in here," they'd say. "She's not one of us." Oakville was a tight-knit town, the kind of place where families had lived forever, and new people stood out like a bright red crayon in a box of grays. Maya was new, and that made some folks suspicious. They didn't know it yet, but Maya wasn't what she seemed. She wasn't just a quiet lady with a mop or a coffee pot. Nope. She had a secret, a big, giant, huge secret. It was the kind of secret that could flip the whole town upside down, like when you shake a snow globe and all the little flakes go wild. Nobody saw it coming. Not the kids on their bikes, not the grown ups on their porches, not even the nosy old lady who watched everyone through her curtains. Maya's secret was locked up tight inside her, and she wasn't ready to let it out, not yet. Let's imagine Oakville for a second. Picture a little town with one main street, where the shops all have colorful signs. There's a bakery that smells like warm cookies, a hardware store with rusty tools in the window, and a diner with a bell that jingles every time someone walks in. The houses are small, with peeling paint and flower pots on the steps. There's a big oak tree right in the middle of town. That's how Oakville got its name. Everyone loved that tree. It was tall and shady, perfect for picnics or just sitting under when the sun got too hot. Maya lived in a tiny house at the edge of town. It wasn't much, just one room with a squeaky bed, a little stove, and a table with wobbly legs. She didn't have fancy stuff like a big TV or shiny new dishes. Her windows had old curtains that didn't match, and her front door creaked every time she opened it. People drove by her house sometimes and didn't even look twice. Poor Maya, they'd think. She's got nothing special going on. But Maya didn't care what they thought. She'd wake up every morning when the sun was just peeking over the hills. She'd stretch her arms, yawn big, and get ready for the day. She'd pull on her old sneakers, grab her bag, and head out to work. Sometimes she'd hum a little song to herself, so quiet no one could hear. Other times, she'd look around at the town with sharp eyes, like she was studying it. If you watched her close, you might wonder why she looked so careful, so smart. But nobody watched her that close, not yet. The people in Oakville liked to talk. Oh boy, did they love to talk. They'd sit at the diner, sipping coffee, and gossip about everyone. "Did you hear about Mr. Thompson's dog running away again?" they'd say. Or, "That new teacher at the school is too strict, my kid hates her." And sometimes, they'd talk about Maya. "She's so quiet," they'd whisper. "What's her story? Where'd she even come from?" Nobody knew much about her past. She didn't tell them, and they didn't ask. They just made up their own ideas. Some folks were nice to Maya. The lady at the bakery, Mrs. Carter, would give her a free cookie sometimes. "You work too hard, dear," she'd say, handing over a chocolate chip one still warm from the oven. Maya would nod and say, "Thank you," in her soft voice. But other people weren't so kind. There was a group of guys, big, loud guys who hung out by the gas station. They'd laugh when Maya walked by with her mop or her coffee tray. "Hey, cleaning lady," they'd yell. "Don't trip over your bucket." Maya never answered back. She'd just keep walking, her face calm, like she didn't hear them. The truth was, Maya heard everything. She saw everything, too. She noticed the way people looked at her, the way they talked behind her back. She saw how the town worked, who was in charge, who made the rules, who broke them. She paid attention to every little detail, like a detective in a mystery book. But she didn't let anyone know she was watching. She kept her secret safe, tucked away like a treasure in a locked box. Let's talk about that secret for a minute, not the whole thing, because that would ruin the surprise. But let's just say Maya wasn't who she pretended to be. She wasn't just a lady who cleaned floors and poured coffee. She was something bigger, something stronger, something nobody in Oakville could guess. Every time she mopped a floor or filled a cup, she was playing a part, like an actor in a movie. And she was good at it, really good. Nobody suspected a thing. Picture this: it's a regular day in Oakville. The sun is blazing, and the air smells like hot pavement and fresh cut grass. Maya's at the diner, wiping down tables with a rag. A guy in a trucker hat grumbles, "More coffee, quick." Maya nods and brings the pot over, pouring it nice and slow. He doesn't say thank you, he just slurps it loud and goes back to his newspaper. Across the room, two old ladies are chatting about the weather. "Too hot for July," one says. "I can't sleep a wink," the other replies. Maya listens, but she doesn't join in. She's busy thinking, planning, waiting. Waiting for what? Oh, you'll see. That's the fun part. This story's just getting started, and Maya's secret is like a big present wrapped up with a bow. You don't get to open it yet, but you can shake it a little and guess what's inside. Was she a spy? A superhero? Something even cooler? The people of Oakville had no clue, and that made it even better. Here's a fun question for you: have you ever met someone who surprised you with who they really are? Maybe a kid at school who seemed shy but turned out to be an awesome singer? Or a neighbor who looked boring but built a treehouse all by themselves? I'd love to hear your stories. Drop them in the comments below, I'm reading every single one. Back to Maya. She didn't mind the hot days or the hard work. She didn't complain when her hands got sore from scrubbing or when her feet ached from standing too long. She just kept going, day after day, like a clock that never stops ticking. But every night, when she got home to her little house, she'd sit at her wobbly table and do something strange. She'd pull out a notebook, a small one with a black cover, and start writing. What was she writing? Names. Plans. Secrets. She'd scribble fast, her pen moving like it had a mind of its own, then snap the book shut and hide it under her mattress. Nobody saw that notebook. Nobody even knew it existed. If they did, they might start asking questions. What's Maya up to, they'd wonder. Why's she so sneaky? But Maya was careful. She didn't leave clues lying around. She didn't talk in her sleep or mumble to herself. She was like a shadow, always there, but hard to catch. The town kept spinning along, same as always. Kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on. Dogs barked at squirrels. The diner's bell jingled, and the bakery's cookie smell floated through the air. Maya was part of it all, but she wasn't really part of it. She was different, and not just because she was new or quiet. She had something inside her, a spark, a fire, a power that nobody could see. Not yet. One day, something big was going to happen in Oakville. Something that would make everyone stop and stare. And Maya, she'd be right in the middle of it. The quiet lady with the mop and the coffee pot was going to shake things up, big time. The people who laughed at her, the ones who whispered, the ones who thought they knew everything, they were in for a shock. But that's for later. Right now, it's just a hot summer day in Oakville. The sun's high, the air's thick, and Maya's wiping down another table. She looks normal, boring even. But she's not. She's hiding something amazing, something that's going to change everything. And the best part? Nobody has a clue. So, what do you think? Who's Maya really? What's her secret? Stick around, because this story's about to get wild. And don't forget my question: have you ever met someone who surprised you? Tell me below, I can't wait to hear. In the little town of Oakville, the police acted like they owned everything. They weren't the kind of cops you see in movies who help people and catch bad guys. No way. These cops were trouble, big trouble. Two of them stood out the most, Officer Dan and Officer Pete. They were like kings walking around with their chests puffed out, thinking nobody could stop them. They didn't just follow the rules, they broke them whenever they wanted. And the people in Oakville? They were too scared to say a word. Officer Dan was tall and loud, with a big belly that jiggled when he laughed. He had a shiny badge pinned to his blue uniform, but he didn't act like it meant anything good. He'd yell at kids for riding bikes too fast, even if they weren't hurting anyone. Get off the street, he'd holler, waving his big hands like he was shooing flies. Officer Pete was shorter, with squinty eyes and a mean smirk. He liked to lean against his police car, chewing gum and staring at people until they looked away. Together, Dan and Pete were a team, a bad team that made everyone nervous. These two cops did whatever they felt like. One time, they stopped Mr. Jenkins, the guy who owned the little grocery store on Main Street. Mr. Jenkins was carrying a bag of apples to his car when Dan blocked his path. "Where you going with those, huh?" Dan asked, even though he knew Mr. Jenkins owned the store. Pete just stood there, popping his gum, watching like it was a game. They made Mr. Jenkins open the bag and show them every single apple, just to mess with him. "Next time, we might not be so nice," Dan said with a laugh as they walked away. Mr. Jenkins didn't say anything, he just picked up his apples and went home, his face red. Everybody in Oakville knew Dan and Pete were no good. Kids whispered about them at school. "Don't look at Officer Dan too long," they'd say. "He'll yell at you for nothing." Grown ups talked about it too, but only in quiet voices when they thought no one was listening. "Those cops are trouble," they'd mutter over coffee at the diner. But what can we do? The answer was always the same: nothing. Nobody dared to stand up to them. Dan and Pete knew it, and they loved it. But the cops weren't the only problem. There was someone else helping them, someone even more powerful. His name was Judge Harlan. He was the big boss of the courtroom, the guy who decided who was right and who was wrong. Judge Harlan wore a long black robe that swished when he walked, and he had a sly grin that made you wonder what he was thinking. His hair was gray and slicked back, and his eyes were sharp, like a hawk watching for its next meal. People were supposed to trust judges, but Judge Harlan wasn't the trusting kind. Whenever Dan and Pete got in trouble, and they got in trouble a lot, Judge Harlan was there to save them. One day, Officer Pete drove his police car right through Mrs. Carter's flower garden. She was the nice lady who ran the bakery, and those flowers were her pride and joy. She marched to the police station, mad as a wet cat, and told them what Pete did. "He smashed my roses," she said, her hands on her hips. Pete just shrugged. "It was an accident," he lied, chewing his gum louder. The case went to court, and guess what? Judge Harlan banged his gavel, a big wooden hammer, and said, "No proof, it was on purpose. Case closed." Then he winked at Pete and laughed. "Boys will be boys," he said, like it was all a big joke. That wasn't the only time. Another day, Officer Dan took money from a kid selling lemonade. The kid, little Tommy, was only 8 years old. He'd set up a stand with a wobbly table and a sign that said, "Lemonade 25 cents. Dan walked up, grabbed 2 cups, drank them fast, and then pocketed all of Tommy's coins. "Thanks, kid," he said, walking off. Tommy ran home crying and told his mom. She went to the police station, then to court. But Judge Harlan just leaned back in his big chair and said, "No witnesses, no crime. Boys will be boys." Dan smirked from the back of the room, and that was that. People in Oakville started calling it the Judge Harlan rule. No matter what Dan and Pete did, breaking stuff, scaring people, taking things that weren't theirs, Judge Harlan let them go. "Boys will be boys," he'd say every time, his sly grin growing wider. It was like a magic spell that made all their trouble disappear. The cops knew they could do anything, and the judge would back them up. It made them bolder, meaner, and louder. And the town? The town got quieter, more afraid. Now, let's talk about Maya Jackson. You remember her, right? The quiet lady who cleaned offices and poured coffee? She saw everything. Maya wasn't loud or nosy, but she had eyes that noticed stuff other people missed. Every night, after the courtroom emptied out, she'd go in with her mop and bucket. The big room was silent, except for the slosh of water and the squeak of her shoes on the floor. But sometimes, it wasn't so silent. Sometimes, Judge Harlan stayed late, and Dan and Pete would sneak in to talk to him. Maya would keep mopping, her head down, pretending she wasn't listening. But oh, she was listening hard. She heard the judge whisper to the cops about secret plans. "Don't worry," Harlan would say in a low voice. "I'll take care of it." Dan would chuckle, his big belly shaking. "You're the best, Judge," he'd reply. Pete would pop his gum and add, "Nobody's gonna stop us." They'd talk about money, about people they didn't like, about ways to keep the town under their thumbs. It was sneaky stuff, the kind of stuff that made your stomach feel funny if you heard it. One night, Maya was scrubbing a spot by the judge's big desk when the three of them walked in. She stayed quiet, moving her mop slow and steady, like she wasn't even there. Judge Harlan didn't notice her at first. He leaned close to Dan and Pete and said, "That shopkeeper, Mr. Jenkins, he's asking too many questions. We need to shut him up." Dan grinned. "I'll scare him good tomorrow," he promised. Pete nodded. "Maybe break a few windows. That'll teach him." Harlan laughed, a sharp, mean laugh. "Perfect," he said. "Just don't get caught, or if you do, I've got you covered." That's when Officer Dan saw Maya. She was in the corner, pushing her mop, her face blank. He stopped laughing and pointed at her. "Hey, you," he barked. "What are you doing here?" Maya looked up, calm as could be. "Just cleaning," she said softly. Dan stomped over, his boots loud on the floor. He towered over her, trying to look scary. "Keep scrubbing, sweetheart," he sneered. "That's all you're good for." Pete snickered, and Judge Harlan waved a hand like she was a fly buzzing around. "She's nobody," he said. "Let her mop." Maya didn't argue. She didn't yell or cry or run away. She just nodded, gave a tiny smile, and went back to her work. The three men turned away, laughing again, thinking she was nothing. They had no idea what was coming. No clue at all. That little smile Maya gave? It wasn't a scared smile or a weak one. It was a secret smile, the kind you make when you know something big and nobody else does. See, Maya wasn't just cleaning floors that night. She was watching. She was listening. She was remembering every word they said, every plan, every laugh, every mean thing. Her hands might have been wet from the mop, but her mind was sharp, like a pencil fresh from the sharpener. She didn't miss a thing. While Dan and Pete bragged and Harlan grinned, Maya was putting it all together in her head, piece by piece, like a puzzle she was saving for later. The next day, things got worse in Oakville. Dan and Pete went after Mr. Jenkins, just like they'd planned. They showed up at his store with loud voices and big attitudes. "You been talking about us, Jenkins?" Dan shouted, knocking over a stack of canned peas. The cans rolled across the floor, clanging loud. Mr. Jenkins, a skinny man with glasses, tried to stay calm. "I didn't say nothing," he stammered. Pete grabbed a broom from the corner and snapped it in half, just to be mean. "Keep your mouth shut," he warned, "or next time it's more than a broom." Mr. Jenkins didn't fight back. He couldn't. He just stood there, watching them leave, his store a mess. Word spread fast around town. People saw the broken broom and the spilled cans through the window. They whispered about it at the diner, at the bakery, on their porches. "Those cops are out of control," they said. But still, nobody did anything. They were too afraid of Dan, Pete, and the judge who protected them. Maya heard about it too. She was pouring coffee at the diner when two old men started talking. "Poor Jenkins," one said, shaking his head. "They're gonna ruin him." The other sipped his coffee and sighed. "And Harlan will just let it slide. Boys will be boys, right?" Maya kept her face blank, but inside, she was boiling. She didn't like bullies. She didn't like people who hurt others just because they could. And she really didn't like that sly grin on Judge Harlan's face. Every night, Maya kept going to the courtroom with her mop. And every night, she kept hearing things. One time, she heard Harlan tell Dan, "We're making good money with this little game. Keep it up." Another time, Pete bragged, "I scared that kid Tommy so bad, he won't even look at me now. They laughed like it was all fun, like they were playing a game and winning every round. Maya stayed quiet, mopping away, but her secret smile got a tiny bit bigger each time. The tension in Oakville grew thicker, like fog rolling in on a cold morning. People stopped smiling as much. Kids didn't ride their bikes near the police station. Even the dogs seemed quieter, hiding under porches instead of barking at squirrels. Dan and Pete strutted around like they owned the whole world, and Judge Harlan sat in his courtroom like a king on a throne. They thought they were untouchable. They thought nobody could stop them. But Maya. She wasn't scared. She wasn't weak. She was waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Dan could sneer all he wanted. Pete could pop his gum and break brooms. Harlan could grin and bang his gavel. They thought she was just a cleaning lady, a nobody with a mop. They were wrong, so wrong. Maya had something up her sleeve, something big, and they didn't even see it coming. What do you think's gonna happen next? Can you feel the trouble brewing? Stick around, because Maya's not done yet, not even close. The days in Oakville started feeling heavy, like the air before a big storm. People walked faster, kept their heads down, and stopped chatting as much. The cops, Officer Dan and Officer Pete, didn't slow down. They kept picking on folks, making trouble wherever they went. One afternoon, they decided to mess with Miss Lucy, the librarian. She was a sweet lady with curly white hair who loved books more than anything. She'd sit at her desk in the tiny library, helping kids find stories about pirates or princesses. Dan and Pete barged in one day, their boots stomping loud on the wooden floor. "Hey, Lucy!" Dan shouted, knocking a stack of books off the counter just for fun. Pages fluttered everywhere, and Miss Lucy jumped up, her glasses slipping down her nose. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice shaky. Pete grabbed a book from a shelf and ripped a page right out. "Oops," he said, grinning. "Guess this one's broken now." They laughed and walked out, leaving Miss Lucy to pick up the mess, her hands trembling. Word got around fast. Kids who loved the library told their parents. They tore up a book, one little girl cried. Miss Lucy looked so sad. Parents shook their heads, but nobody went to the police station to complain. They knew what would happen: nothing. Judge Harlan would just lean back in his big chair, say boys will be boys, and let Dan and Pete go free. It was the same old story, over and over, like a song stuck on repeat. Maya was in the diner that day, wiping tables with her rag, when she heard about Miss Lucy. Two moms were sitting in a booth, talking low. "Those cops are monsters," one said, stirring her coffee. "Poor Lucy didn't deserve that." The other mom nodded. "And Harlan's no better. He's supposed to keep things fair, but he's just as bad." Maya didn't say a word. She kept wiping, moving from table to table, but her ears were wide open. She didn't miss a thing. That night, Maya went to the courtroom like always. The lights were dim, and the air smelled like old wood and cleaning spray. She pushed her mop across the floor, making it shine, when Judge Harlan showed up with Dan and Pete again. They didn't even look at her, just started talking like she was invisible. "Lucy's a problem," Harlan said, his voice low and sneaky. "She might tell people what you did." Dan snorted. "She's too scared to talk," he said. "But I can scare her more if you want." Pete popped his gum loud. "I'll smash her stupid books again," he added. "She'll learn." Maya kept mopping, slow and steady. Her face didn't change, no frown, no gasp, nothing. But inside, she was mad. She liked Miss Lucy. The librarian had given her a book once, a little one about a girl who outsmarted a dragon. Maya didn't read much, but she kept that book on her wobbly table at home. Hearing Dan and Pete talk about hurting Miss Lucy made her grip her mop a little tighter. Judge Harlan chuckled. "Good," he said. "Keep her quiet. We don't need trouble." Then Pete noticed Maya. He squinted at her, chewing his gum slow. "What's she doing here so late?" he asked, pointing. Harlan turned, his sly grin fading for a second. "Just cleaning," he said, waving his hand. "She's harmless." Dan laughed, big and loud. "Yeah, keep scrubbing, sweetheart," he said again, like it was his favorite line. "Don't stop now." They all laughed, thinking it was so funny. Maya gave that tiny smile again, small, secret, sharp. She didn't say a word, just kept mopping. But Maya wasn't harmless. Not even close. She was like a storm waiting to hit, quiet before it got loud. Every time they laughed at her, every time they made plans to hurt someone, she added it to her list. Not a real list on paper, well, maybe she had one of those too, but a list in her head. She remembered every mean thing, every sneaky word. She was building something, step by step, and they didn't even know it. The next morning, Dan and Pete went back to the library. Miss Lucy was there, stacking books, trying to fix what they'd broken. She looked up when they walked in, her eyes wide. "Please," she said, "just leave me alone." Dan grabbed the whole shelf and tipped it over. Books crashed to the floor, some splitting open. "Shut up, Lucy," he snapped. Pete kicked a chair across the room, laughing when it hit the wall. "Next time, we burn the place," he said. They left her crying in the middle of the mess. The town buzzed with whispers after that. Kids stopped going to the library. Parents kept their heads down even more. The air felt tighter, like it was hard to breathe. Dan and Pete didn't care. They strutted around like nothing happened. Judge Harlan didn't care either. He sat in his courtroom, grinning at the next case, ready to let the cops off the hook again. They thought they were winning. They thought nobody could touch them. But Maya was still watching. That night, she mopped the courtroom again. The judge and the cops came in, same as before. "Lucy's done," Harlan said, leaning back in his chair. "She won't talk now." Dan nodded. "Told you I'd handle it," he bragged. Pete smirked. "Next, we hit the diner. Those old guys keep whispering about us." Harlan rubbed his hands together. "Perfect," he said. "Keep them scared. That's how we stay on top." Maya was in the shadows, mopping near the wall. Her bucket sloshed a little, but she stayed quiet. Dan glanced at her and rolled his eyes. "Still here, sweetheart," he said. "You're slow tonight." Pete laughed. "Maybe she likes the show." Harlan waved them off. "She's nothing," he said. "Let her scrub." Maya smiled that secret smile again, just for a second, then kept working. She wasn't slow. She wasn't nothing. She was ready for something big. The cops and the judge thought they ruled Oakville, but they didn't see the trap closing in. Maya wasn't just cleaning floors anymore. She was cleaning up something else, something they'd never expect. The tension was growing, like a rubber band stretched tight, ready to snap. And when it did, oh, it was going to be wild. Days turned into weeks, and the trouble kept piling up. Dan and Pete didn't stop. They couldn't. It was like a game to them, and they loved winning. One day, they went to the park where kids played. Little Sammy, a boy with a red cap, was kicking a soccer ball with his friends. Dan marched over and grabbed the ball. "This yours?" he asked, holding it high. Sammy nodded, scared. Dan kicked it hard into the trees, way out of sight. "Go fetch," he said, laughing. Pete joined in, pushing Sammy's friend into the dirt. "Stay out of our way," he warned. The kids ran off, crying. Parents saw it happen, but they didn't move. They just stood there, frozen. "We can't fight them," one dad whispered to another. "Harlan will cover it up." The park got quiet after that. No more soccer, no more laughing. Just silence and fear. Maya heard about the park too. She was at the diner, pouring coffee, when Sammy's mom came in. "They scared my boy," she said, her voice breaking. "He won't go outside now." The other customers looked down at their plates, not saying anything. Maya filled a cup, her hands steady, but her mind racing. She didn't like seeing kids cry. She didn't like seeing anyone hurt. And she really didn't like how Dan, Pete, and Harlan thought they could do whatever they wanted. That night, in the courtroom, Maya listened again. The trio was back, plotting more trouble. "The park was fun," Dan said, grinning. "Those kids won't mess with us now." Pete nodded. "Let's hit the bakery next. Mrs. Carter's too nosy." Harlan smirked. "Do it," he said. "Break her windows. She'll learn." They laughed, loud and mean, like they owned the whole world. Maya mopped in the corner, her bucket splashing a little. Dan looked over. "Hey, sweetheart," he called. "You're always here. Don't you ever sleep?" Pete snickered. "Maybe she's a ghost." Harlan chuckled. "Leave her," he said. "She's just a mop with legs." They laughed harder, thinking they were so clever. Maya didn't laugh. She smiled small, secret, strong. They didn't know it, but they were digging their own hole, deeper every day. She was watching, waiting, planning. The tension in Oakville was like a balloon blown up too big, ready to pop. And when it did, Maya would be there, holding the pin. Weeks went by in Oakville, and things got worse. The cops, Officer Dan and Officer Pete, didn't just strut around anymore. They acted like they could do anything and get away with it. They were bolder now, meaner, like bullies who knew nobody would stop them. The town felt it, too. People didn't smile as much. They didn't talk as loud. It was like a big, dark cloud was sitting over Oakville, and everyone was waiting for rain, but not the good kind. One day, Dan and Pete decided to pick on Mr. Jenkins again. "You remember him, right? The skinny shopkeeper with glasses who ran the little grocery store? He was a nice guy, always giving kids free candy when they came in with their parents." But Dan and Pete didn't like him. Why? Because Mr. Jenkins wouldn't pay them money. They'd been sneaking around, asking store owners to give them cash for protection. Protection from what? From them, of course. It was a trick, a mean, sneaky trick. Most people paid because they were scared. But Mr. Jenkins said no. "He's gotta learn," Dan said one afternoon, standing outside the store with Pete. Pete nodded, popping his gum loud. "Yeah, let's teach him." So they made up a lie. They said Mr. Jenkins stole a big box of stuff from another shop, cans of soup, bags of rice, things like that. It wasn't true, not even a little bit. Mr. Jenkins didn't steal anything. He worked hard every day, stacking shelves and sweeping floors. But Dan and Pete didn't care about the truth. They marched into his store, acting big and tough. "You're a thief, Jenkins!" Dan yelled, knocking over a pile of apples. The apples rolled everywhere, bouncing on the floor. Mr. Jenkins pushed his glasses up his nose and said, "I didn't take anything." His voice was shaky. He was scared, but he was telling the truth. Pete grabbed a bag of sugar and tore it open, letting it spill all over. "Liar," he shouted. "We caught you." They dragged Mr. Jenkins out of the store, right in front of everyone, and took him to the police station. The town buzzed with anger. People saw it happen. They watched from the diner, from the bakery, from their porches. "He didn't steal," one lady whispered to her friend. "They're making it up." Her friend nodded. "Poor Mr. Jenkins. He's honest." Kids ran around, telling each other, "The cops took Mr. Jenkins. They said he's bad." But even though people were mad, they didn't do anything. They were too afraid. Dan and Pete were scary, and Judge Harlan was scarier. Fear kept everyone quiet, like a big hand holding their mouths shut. The case went to court fast. Mr. Jenkins stood in front of Judge Harlan, looking small and nervous. His glasses were crooked, and his hands shook a little. "I didn't steal," he said again, his voice soft but clear. "I swear." Dan and Pete stood in the back, smirking like they'd already won. Judge Harlan leaned forward in his big chair, his black robe swishing. He didn't even listen to Mr. Jenkins for long. He didn't ask questions or look at proof. He just banged his gavel bam, and said, "Guilty. Case closed." Then he winked at Dan and Pete, like it was a game. The room went quiet. Mr. Jenkins's shoulders slumped. He had to pay a big fine, money he didn't have, or go to jail. People in the courtroom shook their heads, but nobody spoke up. Dan laughed loud, his belly jiggling. Pete popped his gum and gave a thumbs up to the judge. They walked out like they owned the whole town, leaving Mr. Jenkins to figure out how to save his store. Maya was there. She stood in the back of the courtroom, near the door, where nobody noticed her. She didn't have her mop this time. She'd come during the day, blending in with the crowd. Her eyes were sharp, like a cat watching a mouse. She saw everything, the judge's wink, the cop's smirks, Mr. Jenkins's sad face. She didn't say a word, but she felt it all. She didn't like bullies. She didn't like lies. and she really didn't like how Judge Harlan made it all okay. After that day, Maya started carrying a little notebook. It was small, with a black cover, and it fit right in her pocket. She didn't let anyone see it, oh no, she was too smart for that. But whenever something happened, she'd pull it out when she was alone and write stuff down. She wrote the dates like July 10th, cops frame Mr. Jenkins. She wrote the lies like Dan said he stole soup, but he didn't. She even wrote about the secret meetings she'd heard in the courtroom at night, when the judge and cops thought she wasn't listening. Her pen moved fast, scribbling every detail, every word. Why was she doing this? What was she up to? Nobody knew, not yet. But Maya wasn't just mopping floors and pouring coffee anymore. She was collecting things, like a kid picking up shiny rocks on the beach. Only her rocks weren't shiny, they were secrets, big ones, and she was saving them for something. The town kept buzzing, but it was a quiet buzz, like bees stuck in a jar. People were mad about Mr. Jenkins, but they didn't know what to do. One night, at the diner, Maya heard two old men talking. Jenkins is ruined, one said, sipping his coffee. He'll lose the store now. The other man frowned. It's not right. Those cops are rotten, and Harlan's worse. Maya wiped a table nearby, pretending she didn't hear, but she did. She wrote it down later, July 11th, people mad but scared. Dan and Pete didn't stop with Mr. Jenkins. They kept going, getting bolder every day. One afternoon, they went to the park again. Little Sammy, the boy with the red cap, was back, trying to play with his friends. He'd found his soccer ball in the trees and was kicking it around. Dan saw him and stomped over. You again, he growled, snatching the ball. Sammy froze. Give it back, he said, his voice tiny. Dan held it high, then threw it into the pond. It splashed and sank. Oops, he said, laughing. Pete pushed Sammy into the grass. Stay down, kid, he warned. They walked off, leaving Sammy crying in the dirt. Parents saw it from the benches. That's too far, one mom whispered. He's just a kid. But they didn't move. They didn't yell or call anyone. Fear locked them in place. Sammy's mom ran over, picked him up, and hugged him tight. It's okay, she said, but her eyes were wet. The park got quiet after that. No more games, no more fun. Maya heard about Sammy too. She was at the diner again, pouring coffee, when Sammy's mom came in. They threw his ball in the water, she said to the waitress. He's so upset. The waitress shook her head. Those cops are awful. Maya kept her face blank, but inside, she was steaming. She didn't like seeing kids hurt. She wrote it down that night, July 15th, Dan and Pete scare Sammy, throw ball in pond. Every night, Maya went to the courtroom with her mop. And every night, she heard more. One time, she was cleaning near the judge's desk when Harlan, Dan, and Pete came in. They didn't see her in the shadows. Jenkins is done, Harlan said, his voice low. He's selling the store to pay the fine. Dan grinned. Good. One less problem. Pete popped his gum. Who's next? Harlan leaned back. Anyone who talks. No one's dumb enough to challenge us. He laughed, sharp and mean. Maya froze, her mop still. No one's dumb enough to challenge us. Those words stuck in her head. She wrote them down later, her pen pressing hard into the paper, July 17th, Harlan says no one will fight back. Oh, how wrong he was. So wrong. Maya wasn't dumb. She wasn't scared. She was something else, something they didn't expect. The next day, Dan and Pete went after Mrs. Carter, the bakery lady. She'd been whispering about them, saying they shouldn't scare kids like Sammy. They didn't like that. They walked into her shop, the bell jingling loud. Heard you're talking, Carter, Dan said, grabbing a cookie from the counter and eating it without paying. Mrs. Carter crossed her arms. You can't just take things, she said. Pete smirked, then knocked over a tray of muffins. They hit the floor, crumbling everywhere. Watch us, he said. They left, laughing, while Mrs. Carter swept up the mess. People saw that too. They're out of control, one man said at the diner. Someone's gotta stop them. But nobody did. Fear was too strong. Maya wrote it down, July 20th, cops ruin Mrs. Carter's muffins. Her notebook was getting full page after page of dates, lies, and mean stuff. She hid it under her mattress at home, safe and secret. One night, something big happened. Maya was mopping the courtroom, late as usual, when the trio came in again. They were loud, excited. "We're untouchable," Dan bragged, slapping Pete on the back. "Nobody's gonna mess with us." Harlan nodded. "Keep it up. More money, more power." Pete grinned. "Next, we hit the diner. Those old guys need a lesson." They laughed, planning more trouble, thinking they were kings. Maya was near the wall, her mop moving slow. She heard every word. Her notebook wasn't with her, she'd left it at home, but she didn't need it. She remembered. Her sharp eyes watched them, her quiet ears listened. Dan glanced at her. "Hey, sweetheart," he called. "Still scrubbing?" Pete laughed. "She's like a robot." Harlan waved a hand. "Ignore her. She's nothing." "Nothing?" Maya's secret smile came back, just for a second. She wasn't nothing. She was everything they didn't see. Her notebook was full of proof, dates, times, lies. She was taking small steps, quiet steps, towards something huge. They thought she was just a cleaning lady. They were wrong. She was a storm building up, a puzzle coming together, a surprise they'd never guess. The town kept buzzing, but it was a scared buzz now. People locked their doors at night. Kids stayed inside. Dan and Pete got worse, and Judge Harlan kept helping them. But Maya. She kept watching, writing, waiting. Small revelations were popping up like little lights in the dark. She knew their secrets. She knew their plans. And soon, she'd use them. What do you think Maya's planning? Any guesses? Drop them below, I'd love to hear. This story's heating up, and Maya's just getting started. The next big court day in Oakville came fast, like a train zooming into the station. It was a hot morning, the kind where your shirt sticks to your back and you wish for a breeze that never comes. The courtroom was packed full, every seat taken, people standing in the back, even kids peeking through the windows. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. The air buzzed with whispers, like bees in a hive, because the cops, Officer Dan and Officer Pete, were in trouble again. This time, it was serious. A teenager named Joey had gotten into it with them. Joey was a skinny kid with messy hair and a loud voice. He wasn't afraid to talk back, and that made Dan and Pete mad. A few days ago, Joey was walking home from the park when the cops stopped him. "What you doing out here?" Dan asked, his big belly shaking as he stepped closer. Joey shrugged. "Just walking," he said. Pete didn't like that answer. "You got a smart mouth," he snapped, popping his gum loud. Joey rolled his eyes and said, "You don't scare me." "Big mistake." Dan grabbed Joey by the shirt and shoved him against a tree. "Say that again," he growled. Pete kicked Joey's legs, making him fall hard on the ground. "Smart kids get hurt," Pete said, laughing. They roughed him up, pushing, hitting, leaving bruises on his arms and a cut on his lip. Joey didn't cry, but he was scared. Some grown UPS saw it happen, and word spread fast. Joey's mom was furious. She marched to the police station and said, "You can't hurt my son." But the cops just smirked. "Prove it," Dan said, knowing they'd get away with it like always. So now, here they were in court. The room was hot and stuffy, with fans spinning slow on the ceiling. Joey sat with his mom near the front, his lips still swollen. Dan and Pete stood in the back, looking smug, their uniforms wrinkled but their badges shiny. Judge Harlan sat up high in his big chair, his black robe hanging loose. He had that sly grin on his face, the one that said he didn't care about the truth. The crowd waited, holding their breath, wondering if this time would be different. But they didn't think so. It was always the same. Harlan would let the cops go free. The judge banged his gavel, bam, and the room got quiet. "Let's hear it," he said, leaning back like he was bored. Joey's mom stood up, her voice shaky but loud. "They hurt my boy," she said, pointing at Dan and Pete. "He's got bruises. People saw it." She held up a picture of Joey's arm, all purple and black. The crowd murmured, nodding. They'd seen Joey limping around town. They knew she was right. Dan stepped forward, his big boots thumping. "She's lying," he said, crossing his arms. "Kid tripped and fell. We didn't touch him." Pete nodded. "Yeah, he's clumsy. Not our fault." They grinned at each other, not even trying to hide it. The crowd whispered louder. Some people looked mad, some looked scared. Joey's mom shouted, "That's not true. You hit him." But Judge Harlan held up a hand to stop her. "No evidence," he started to say, his voice smooth and lazy. "No proof, no case." He was ready to bang his gavel again, to make it all go away. Dan winked at Pete. Pete popped his gum. They thought they'd won, just like every other time. The crowd sighed, slumping in their seats. They knew how this ended. Boys will be boys, and the cops would walk free. But then something happened. Something big. The back of the room got noisy. People turned their heads, craning their necks to see. A woman stood up, slow and steady, like she'd been waiting for this exact moment. It was Maya Jackson. The quiet lady who mopped floors and poured coffee. The one nobody paid attention to. She didn't look quiet now. She didn't look small or scared. She looked strong, like a tree that wouldn't bend in a storm. The crowd gasped loud, sharp, like they'd all sucked in air at once. Maya wasn't wearing her old, worn-out clothes. No faded jeans, no messy bun, no coffee stains. She had on a crisp suit, black and neat, with a white shirt underneath. Her hair was pulled back tight, shiny and smooth. Her shoes weren't sneakers, they were heels, clicking loud on the floor as she started walking. Click, click, click. Every step echoed, cutting through the whispers. Heads turned. Eyes got wide. Who was this? Maya walked right to the front of the room, her head held high. She didn't rush. She didn't shake. She moved like she belonged there, like she'd been waiting for this day forever. The crowd couldn't stop staring. Joey's mom froze, her mouth open. Dan and Pete stopped smirking, their faces went blank, then confused. Judge Harlan sat up straight, his sly grin gone. His jaw dropped, hanging there like a fish caught on a hook. "Who do you think you are?" he barked, his voice loud but wobbly. Maya stopped in front of the judge's big desk. She looked at him, then at Dan and Pete, then at the whole room. Her eyes were sharp, like they could see right through you. She didn't yell. She didn't need to. Her voice was calm but strong, like a river that keeps flowing no matter what. "I'm Maya Jackson," she said. "United States Attorney. And I've been watching you all for months." The room went dead silent. Not a whisper, not a cough, not even a breath. It was like time stopped. United States Attorney? Maya? The cleaning lady? People blinked, trying to understand. Dan's face turned red. Pete's gum fell out of his mouth and stuck to his shirt. Judge Harlan gripped his gavel so tight his knuckles went white. "What?" he sputtered. "You're, what?" Maya didn't flinch. She reached into her suit pocket and pulled out a shiny badge, gold and official, with her name on it. She held it up high so everyone could see. The crowd gasped again, louder this time. Then she pulled out a big stack of papers, thick, heavy, full of writing, and slapped it down on the table in front of the judge. Thump. The sound bounced off the walls. "This," she said, "is proof. Proof of every dirty deal, every lie, every crime you've done." The room stayed silent, but you could feel it, the shock, the surprise, the woe. People leaned forward, staring at the papers. Joey's mom covered her mouth. Mr. Jenkins, sitting in the back, pushed his glasses up and whispered, "No way." Mrs. Carter from the bakery grabbed her friend's arm. "Is that Maya?" she said. Kids by the windows jumped up and down, pointing. "She's a hero," one yelled. Judge Harlan stared at the papers like they were a snake about to bite him. "This is nonsense," he shouted, but his voice cracked. He didn't sound sure anymore. Dan took a step back, his big belly wobbling. "She's lying," he yelled. Pete nodded fast. "Yeah, she's crazy. She's just the mop lady." But nobody believed them now. The crowd was buzzing again, louder, excited. Maya didn't stop. She opened the stack of papers and started reading. "July 10th, she said, her voice clear. "You framed Mr. Jenkins for stealing. He didn't do it, I have witnesses. She flipped a page. July 15th, you threw Sammy's ball in the pond and pushed him down. I have pictures. Another page. July 20th, you smashed Mrs. Carter's muffins and took her cookies. I have the broken tray. She kept going, listing every bad thing, every secret meeting, every mean trick, every lie. Her notebook had it all, and now it was out. Dan's face went from red to white. How does she know, he stammered. Pete looked around, like he wanted to run. Judge Harlan banged his gavel, bam, bam, bam. Quiet, he yelled. This is my court. But nobody listened. The crowd was too loud now, shouting, cheering. She's got them, someone yelled. They're done, another said. Maya kept talking, calm and steady. I've been here every night, she said. Cleaning, listening, watching. You thought I was nothing. You were wrong. She pointed at Harlan. You made deals with them. She pointed at Dan and Pete. You hurt people. I wrote it all down. I recorded it. I got proof from people who saw people you scared into silence. They're not silent now. She pulled out a little recorder from her pocket, a tiny black box with buttons. She pressed play, and voices came out: Harlan's voice, Dan's voice, Pete's voice. No one's dumb enough to challenge us, Harlan's voice said, sneaky and low. Break Jenkins's windows, Dan's voice laughed. Burn the library, Pete's voice added. The crowd gasped again, louder than ever. It was them, clear as day, caught on tape. Judge Harlan stood up, his robe flapping. Turn that off, he shouted, but his face was sweaty now. He didn't look like a king anymore, he looked small, scared. Dan tried to grab the recorder, but Maya stepped back, quick and smooth. Don't touch it, she said, her voice like steel. Pete froze, his hands shaking. We're done, he whispered to Dan. The crowd exploded: cheers, yells, clapping. Get them, someone shouted. Justice, another cried. Joey's mom hugged him tight, tears in her eyes. Mr. Jenkins stood up, clapping slow at first, then fast. Mrs. Carter waved her arms like she was at a party. Kids jumped and screamed, Maya's the best. The room shook with noise, like a storm breaking loose. Maya didn't cheer. She didn't smile big or dance around. She stood there, tall and strong, her badge shining, her papers spread out. She looked at Harlan, then Dan, then Pete. You thought you could hurt people and laugh, she said. Not anymore. I'm here to stop you. Judge Harlan sat down hard, his gavel falling to the floor. Dan's big belly stopped jiggling, he looked like he might cry. Pete's gum was still stuck to his shirt, and his smirk was gone for good. The crowd kept cheering, louder and louder, until the walls seemed to shake. Maya had done it, she'd flipped everything upside down, just like she'd planned. And that was it, the big reveal. Maya wasn't just a cleaning lady. She was a United States attorney, a superhero with a badge, a lady who'd been watching and waiting and working in secret. All those months of mopping, all those nights of listening, all those pages in her notebook, it all led to this. The cops and the judge thought they were untouchable. They were wrong. Maya had the proof, the power, and the truth. And now, everyone knew. The room stayed loud, wild, happy. People hugged each other, clapped, shouted her name. Maya! Maya, they chanted. She'd turned the whole town upside down in one big moment, and it felt good, really, really good. The bad guys were caught, and the good guys were free. It wasn't over yet, not quite, but this was the top of the hill, the big bang, the moment everything changed. The courtroom was a mess of noise: cheers, shouts, clapping hands, stomping feet. It was like a big party breaking out, but not the kind with cake and balloons. This was a party of people who'd been scared for too long, finally letting it all out. Maya Jackson stood there, her crisp suit sharp and her badge gleaming, while the crowd chanted her name. Maya! Maya, they yelled, over and over, like she was a superhero who just saved the day. And maybe she was. Judge Harlan didn't know what to do. He'd dropped his gavel when he sat down hard, and it rolled under his big desk. His face was red and sweaty, his sly grin gone like it'd been wiped off with a rag. He kept staring at Maya's stack of papers, those papers full of every bad thing he'd done. This "This isn't real," he shouted, but his voice sounded weak now, like a kid whining about a lost toy. Nobody listened to him. The crowd was too busy cheering. Officer Dan and Officer Pete were a mess too. Dan's big belly shook, but not from laughing this time. He looked like he might fall over. His hands were in fists, but they didn't look strong anymore. "She can't do this," he yelled, pointing at Maya. "She's lying. She's just the cleaning lady." Pete nodded fast, his gum still stuck to his shirt. "Yeah, she's nobody. This is crazy." But their voices got swallowed up in the noise. Nobody believed them, not now, not with Maya standing there like a boss. Maya didn't yell back. She didn't need to. She just looked at them, Harlan, Dan, Pete, with those sharp eyes of hers. "You're done," she said, calm and clear. "All of you. I've got everything, your words, your deals, your crimes. You can't hide anymore." She tapped the stack of papers with her hand, and the thump was loud enough to make Pete jump. The recorder was still in her other hand, those sneaky voices playing on a loop, Harlan saying, "No one's dumb enough to challenge us," Dan laughing about breaking windows, Pete bragging about burning books. It was all there, and they couldn't run from it. The crowd went wilder. Joey's mom stood up, clapping so hard her hands turned red. "You got them, Maya," she shouted. Joey, with his swollen lip, pumped his fist in the air. "Yeah," he yelled, his voice cracking a little. Mr. Jenkins, the shopkeeper, wiped his glasses on his shirt and smiled his first real smile in weeks. Mrs. Carter from the bakery waved her arms like she was cheering at a ball game. "Take them down," she hollered. Even the kids outside banged on the windows, yelling, "Maya's the best. Maya's the best." Judge Harlan tried to take control. He grabbed the edge of his desk and pulled himself up, his robe flapping like a broken wing. "Order," he shouted. "Order in my court." He reached for his gavel, fumbling under the desk until he found it. He banged it hard, bam, 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 but it was like trying to stop a river with a stick. The noise didn't stop. People kept cheering, shouting, stomping. "You're not the boss anymore," someone yelled from the back. "Maya is," another voice added. Harlan's face got redder, like a tomato about to burst. Dan and Pete started backing up, their boots scooting on the floor. "We gotta get out of here," Pete whispered to Dan, his eyes darting to the door. Dan nodded, sweat dripping down his forehead. "Yeah, let's go." They turned to run, pushing through the crowd, but people didn't move out of the way. "Not so fast," a big guy in a plaid shirt said, blocking them. "You're not running this time," a lady with a baby on her hip added, stepping in front. The crowd closed in, like a wall of mad, brave people who'd had enough. Maya saw them trying to escape. She stepped forward, her heels clicking again. "Stop," she said, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. Everyone froze, even Dan and Pete. She pointed at the door. "You're not going anywhere. Not yet." Then she turned to the side of the room, where a big window showed the street outside. People gasped again, louder than before. Out there, in the bright sunlight, were more people in suits. Not just any suits, fancy ones, with badges like Maya's. United States agents. They'd been waiting, quiet and ready, just outside the courthouse. The agents burst through the door, 5 of them, all tall and serious. They had handcuffs dangling from their belts and papers in their hands. "Judge Harlan, Officer Dan, Officer Pete," one agent said, his voice loud and deep. "You're under arrest." The crowd roared, like a lion waking up. "Yes." Joey shouted. "Get them." Mrs. Carter cheered. The kids outside jumped so high they almost broke the windows. Dan tried to push past. "You can't do this," he yelled, swinging his big arm. But an agent grabbed him, quick as a flash, and clicked handcuffs on his wrists. "Oh, we can," the agent said. Pete tried to duck under a table, but another agent pulled him out by his shirt. "Nice try," she said, snapping cuffs on him too. Pete's gum fell off his shirt and stuck to the floor. Harlan didn't fight, he just sat there, his hands shaking, until an agent walked up and cuffed him right in his big chair. "Time's up," the agent said. The crowd couldn't believe it. They clapped and hugged and shouted Maya's name louder than ever. "Maya! Maya!" It was like music, bouncing off the walls. Joey's mom ran up and hugged her. "Thank you," she said, tears on her cheeks. Mr. Jenkins shook her hand, his glasses foggy. "You saved my store," he said. Mrs. Carter pushed through and gave her a big bear hug. "You're amazing," she said. Even little Sammy, the boy with the red cap, waved from the back. "You're my hero," he yelled. Maya didn't hug back much, she wasn't big on hugs. But she nodded, her face calm but proud. "I did my job," she said. "That's all." But it wasn't just a job, it was everything. She'd been watching for months, writing in her notebook, listening in the shadows. She'd heard every mean word, every sneaky plan, every laugh from Harlan, Dan, and Pete. And now, she'd turned it all against them. Her papers, her recorder, her badge, they were like weapons, and she'd won the fight. The agents started walking the bad guys out. Dan dragged his feet, his head down. "This ain't fair," he mumbled. Pete kept quiet, his face pale. Harlan tried to look big, puffing out his chest, but the handcuffs made him look small. "I'll be back," he muttered, but nobody cared. The crowd booed as they left, big, loud boos that followed them out the door. "Good riddance," someone shouted. "Bye-bye," a kid added, giggling. Outside, the sun was bright, and more people were waiting. Word had spread fast Oakville wasn't big, and news traveled like wildfire. Folks lined the street, watching as the agents put Harlan, Dan, and Pete into big black cars. "They're gone," a lady cheered, clapping her hands. Finally, a man yelled, waving his hat. Kids ran around, laughing like it was a holiday. The cars drove off, tires crunching on the gravel, and the bad guys disappeared. Back in the courtroom, Maya picked up her papers and her recorder. People crowded around her, still cheering. "How'd you do it?" Mr. Jenkins asked, his eyes wide. Maya tapped her badge. "I'm a United States attorney," she said. "It's my job to stop people like them." Mrs. Carter tilted her head. "But why here? Why Oakville?" Maya looked around, her sharp eyes soft for a second. "Because nobody else would," she said. "You needed help." Joey pushed through, holding his mom's hand. "You're so cool," he said, grinning. "Did you really trick them?" Maya nodded. "I listened," she said. "I watched. I waited. They didn't see me coming." Joey's mom smiled. "You're a hero," she said. Maya shook her head. "I'm just Maya," she said, but the crowd didn't agree. "Hero. Hero," they chanted. The noise didn't stop. People started telling stories: how Dan broke Mr. Jenkins's broom, how Pete scared Sammy, how Harlan laughed at everyone. "She got them all," a man said, laughing. "Every single one," a lady added. Kids made up a song on the spot: "Maya, Maya, saved the day, made the bad guys go away." They sang it loud, jumping around. Maya didn't stay long. She had work to do, papers to file, agents to talk to. She walked toward the door, her heels clicking again. "Wait." Mrs. Carter called. She ran up with a bag of cookies, chocolate chip, still warm. "For you," she said. Maya took it, her first real smile showing. "Thanks," she said, soft but real. Then she stepped outside, into the sun, while the crowd kept cheering behind her. The courtroom emptied out slow. People hugged, laughed, cried a little. Joey kicked an imaginary ball, pretending he was free again. Mr. Jenkins talked about fixing his store. Mrs. Carter planned a big party with free muffins for everyone. The kids kept singing their song, louder and sillier each time. Oakville wasn't quiet anymore, it was alive, buzzing, happy. Maya stood outside, looking at the town. The big oak tree in the middle waved its branches in the breeze. The bakery smelled sweet. The diner's bell jingled as people went in, talking fast about what just happened. She'd done it, she'd flipped everything upside down, just like she'd planned. Harlan, Dan, and Pete were gone, and the town could breathe again. But Maya wasn't done, not yet. She had more to do, more to fix. She tucked her badge in her pocket, held her cookies tight, and started walking. The crowd's cheers followed her, fading slow as she moved down the street. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The big reveal was over, But her story? It was still going. The courtroom was louder than it had ever been. People were clapping, cheering, stomping their feet like they were at a big game. Maya Jackson stood in the middle of it all, her crisp suit neat and her badge shining bright. She'd just dropped the biggest surprise ever. She wasn't just a cleaning lady, she was a United States attorney, and she'd caught Judge Harlan, Officer Dan, and Officer Pete red-handed. Her stack of papers and little recorder sat on the table, proof of all their bad stuff laid out for everyone to see. Panic flashed across Judge Harlan's face. His sly grin was gone, and his eyes got big, like a kid caught sneaking cookies. He leaned forward in his big chair, sweat dripping down his forehead. This can't be real," he shouted, but his voice shook. He didn't sound like a tough judge anymore, he sounded scared. Maya didn't blink. She kept talking, her voice calm but strong, like a teacher who knows she's right. "I've got recordings," she said, holding up the little black box. "I've got witnesses. And I've got your own words on paper. You're done." The crowd cheered louder, way louder. "Yeah, Maya," someone yelled. "You got him," another shouted. Judge Harlan's hands shook as he gripped his desk. He looked at the papers, then at Maya, then at the crowd. He didn't know what to do. His tricks weren't working anymore. The truth was out, and it was big. Officer Dan and Officer Pete weren't doing much better. Their smug grins, the ones they always wore when they thought they'd won, were gone. Dan's big belly jiggled as he turned to Pete, his face red and sweaty. "We gotta get outta here," he whispered, loud enough for people nearby to hear. Pete nodded fast, his gum still stuck to his shirt from earlier. "Yeah, let's go," he said, his voice high and squeaky. They started moving toward the door, pushing through the crowd, trying to slip out like sneaky rats. But they didn't get far. The big courtroom doors swung open, bam, and federal agents stepped in. These weren't regular cops. They were the serious kind, with dark suits and shiny badges, like the ones you see in movies. There were 5 of them, tall and strong, and they blocked the doors like a wall. Dan stopped so fast he almost fell over. Pete bumped into him, his eyes wide. "Who are they?" he squeaked. The crowd gasped, then cheered even more. "They're caught," a lady shouted. "No running now," a kid added, jumping up and down. Maya turned to the agents and nodded, like she'd been waiting for them. "They're here because I told them," she said, her voice steady. "I've been working with them for months." The agents stepped forward, their boots loud on the floor. "Judge Harlan, Officer Dan, Officer Pete," one agent said, his voice deep and firm. "You're under arrest." The crowd roared, like a big wave crashing on the beach. "Yes." Joey's mom yelled. "Finally." Mr. Jenkins cheered. Dan tried to push past. "You can't arrest me," he shouted, waving his big arms. But an agent grabbed him quick, twisting his arm behind his back. Click, handcuffs snapped on his wrists. "Oh, we can," the agent said, not even smiling. Pete ducked down, trying to hide behind a chair, but another agent pulled him up by his collar. "Not today," she said, cuffing him too. Pete's face went white, like he'd seen a ghost. Judge Harlan didn't fight, he just sat there, his head down, until an agent walked up and put handcuffs on him right in his big judge chair. "You're done," the agent said, pulling him up. In minutes, just minutes, Judge Harlan and the cops were in handcuffs. Their smug grins were gone, replaced by frowns and sweaty faces. Dan's shoulders slumped, his big belly looking smaller somehow. Pete kept looking at the floor, like he didn't want to see anyone. Harlan's fancy robe hung loose, and his gray hair stuck to his forehead. They didn't look like kings anymore, they looked like losers, caught and trapped. The townspeople cheered as loud as they could. It was like the whole room shook. "Maya! Maya!" they chanted, clapping and hugging each other. Maya stood tall, her head high, watching the agents take the bad guys away. She didn't cheer or jump around, she was too calm for that, but you could tell she was proud. She'd done something huge, something nobody else could. The agents started walking Harlan, Dan, and Pete out of the courtroom. The crowd parted to let them through, but they didn't stay quiet. "Boo!" people shouted, loud and long. "Get out of our town," a man yelled, shaking his fist. Kids stuck out their tongues and made silly faces. "Bye-bye, bullies," little Sammy called, waving his red cap. Dan grumbled something under his breath, but nobody cared. Pete tripped over his own feet, and the crowd laughed. Harlan tried to look big, puffing out his chest, but the handcuffs made him look silly. "I'll be back," he muttered, but everyone just booed louder. Outside, the big black cars were waiting. The sun was bright, and the street was full of people more than ever. Word had spread fast, like when you tell a secret and it gets to everyone in 5 minutes. Folks lined up along the sidewalk, watching as the agents pushed the bad guys into the cars. "They're gone," a lady cheered, clapping her hands. "Good riddance," a man shouted, waving his hat. Kids ran around, giggling like it was a party. The car doors slammed shut, bang, 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 and the engine started. The tires crunched on the gravel, and just like that, Judge Harlan, Officer Dan, and Officer Pete were gone. Back inside, the courtroom was still buzzing. People turned to Maya, their eyes big and shiny. Mr. Jenkins, the shopkeeper, was the first to move. He'd been sitting in the back, quiet until now. He walked up to Maya, his glasses crooked from all the excitement. "You're free," she said to him, her voice soft but clear. "They lied about you stealing. The truth's out now." Mr. Jenkins's mouth opened, then closed, like he didn't know what to say. Then he smiled a big, happy smile and shook her hand. "Thank you," he said. "You saved my store." The crowd cheered again, smaller this time, but warm. "Yay, Mr. Jenkins," a kid shouted. Maya nodded. "No more fines," she said. "No more jail. You're good." Mr. Jenkins wiped his eyes, his glasses fogging up. "I can't believe it," he said. "You're amazing." He turned to the crowd and waved, like he'd won a prize. People clapped for him, happy he was free. Then Joey's mom came up, holding Joey's hand. Joey's lip was still puffy, but he was grinning now. "You stopped them," his mom said, her voice wobbly. "They hurt my boy, and you made it right." Joey nodded fast. "You're so cool, Maya," he said, bouncing on his toes. Maya looked at him, her sharp eyes soft for a second. "Nobody's hurting you again," she said. "They're gone." Joey's mom hugged her tight, and this time, Maya hugged back a little. "Thank you," the mom whispered. The crowd clapped again, shouting, "Go, Joey." Mrs. Carter from the bakery pushed through next. She had flour on her apron and a big smile on her face. "You got them for me too," she said, grabbing Maya's hand. "They smashed my muffins, took my cookies, now they're paying for it." Maya nodded. "They won't bother you anymore," she said. Mrs. Carter laughed loud. "Good. I'm baking you a cake, biggest one ever." The crowd cheered, "Cake. Cake," and Mrs. Carter hugged Maya so hard she almost fell over. One by one, people came up. Sammy, the boy with the red cap, ran over with his mom. "They threw my ball in the pond," he said, "but you stopped them." Maya smiled a real smile this time. "You can play again," she said. "No more bullies." Sammy's mom shook her hand. "You're a hero," she said. Sammy nodded. "The best hero." The crowd clapped more, chanting, "Maya! Maya!" People who'd ignored Maya before, who'd walked past her with her mop or coffee pot, now rushed to say hi. The old men from the diner, the ones who grumbled about the cops, shuffled up. "We didn't know," one said, scratching his head. "You're something special." Maya shrugged. "I was just doing my job," she said, but they shook their heads. "No way," the other man said. "You're the best thing that happened to Oakville." They shook her hand, slow and careful, like she was a queen. Even Miss Lucy, the librarian, came in. She'd heard the news and ran over from the library, her curly white hair bouncing. "They broke my books," she said, her voice soft. "You fixed it?" Maya nodded. "They're gone now," she said. "Your library's safe." Miss Lucy smiled, her eyes shiny. "Thank you, Maya," she said, and the crowd cheered again, "Yay, Miss Lucy." The room was full of happy noise, laughing, talking, clapping. Kids ran around, pretending to be agents with badges. Grown UPS hugged each other, their faces bright. Maya stood there, watching it all. She'd cleaned up more than just floors, she'd cleaned up Oakville. The lies were gone. The bullies were gone. The truth had won, big time. Outside, the sun started to set, turning the sky orange and pink. People spilled out of the courtroom, still talking fast. She did it, a lady said, waving her arms. Maya saved us, a man added, grinning. Kids made up a new game. They pretended to be Maya, chasing imaginary bad guys down the street. You're under arrest, they shouted, giggling. Mrs. Carter ran to her bakery and started baking muffins, cookies, that big cake she promised. Free for everyone, she yelled, and people cheered more. Mr. Jenkins opened his store again, putting up a sign, back in business thanks, Maya. Joey and Sammy kicked a new soccer ball in the park, laughing loud. The town wasn't quiet anymore. It was alive, happy, free. Maya walked out last, her papers tucked under her arm. The federal agents were gone, driving the bad guys away. She looked at the big oak tree in the middle of town, its leaves rustling in the breeze. People waved at her, still saying thanks. You're the best, Maya, a kid shouted. She waved back, small and quick, then started walking home. Her little house was waiting, the one with the squeaky bed and wobbly table. She'd hide her notebook there, safe under the mattress. She didn't need it anymore, not for this fight, anyway. She'd won. Harlan, Dan, and Pete were gone, locked up far away. The shopkeeper was free. The kids could play. The truth was out, and justice was served. Maya didn't need big cheers or fancy prizes. She'd done what she came to do. Oakville was clean, not just the floors, but the whole town. And as she walked, the sun dipping low, she knew one thing for sure, nobody would mess with this place again. Not while she was around. The sun was setting over Oakville, painting the sky with pretty colors: orange, pink, and a little bit of purple. It was like the town was getting a big, warm hug from the day, saying goodbye. Maya Jackson stood outside her little house, the one with the squeaky bed and wobbly table. She looked out at the town she'd saved, her sharp eyes soft for once. The streets were busy with people laughing, kids playing, and grown-ups talking loud and happy. It wasn't quiet anymore, not like before, when everyone was scared. Now, it was alive, buzzing like a beehive full of happy bees. Maya didn't need a big party or a shiny medal. She didn't even need people to say thank you 100 times, though they did, over and over, all day long. She'd done what she did because it was right. That's who she was. She saw a town full of bullies: Judge Harlan, Officer Dan, and Officer Pete, and she knew somebody had to stop them. Nobody else could, so she did. She mopped floors, poured coffee, and listened in the shadows until the perfect moment came. And when it did, boom! She turned everything upside down and made it better. As she watched the sun dip lower, Maya thought about something big. Sometimes, the person you least expect is the one who changes everything. Think about it. People in Oakville saw her every day pushing her mop, carrying her coffee pot, and they didn't look twice. Oh, that's just Maya, they'd say. She's quiet. She's nobody special. They judged her by what they saw on the outside: old clothes, messy hair, a job that didn't seem important. But inside, Maya was strong, smart, and brave. She was a United States attorney with a badge and a plan, and she proved them all wrong. The bad guys, Harlan, Dan, and Pete, thought they were untouchable. They strutted around like kings, laughing at everyone, breaking rules because they could. They thought nobody would dare stand up to them. Who's gonna stop us, they'd say, grinning and winking at each other. They never saw Maya coming. Not in a million years. She was too quiet, too sneaky, too good at hiding who she really was. And that's why she won, because they didn't expect her. Those who think they're untouchable? They never see it coming when someone brave steps up. Maya leaned against her creaky front door, the sunset glowing on her face. She didn't smile big, she wasn't the big smile type, but she felt good inside. The town was safe now. Mr. Jenkins could run his store without fear. Joey and Sammy could kick their soccer balls in the park. Mrs. Carter could bake her muffins and cookies without bullies smashing them. Miss Lucy could stack her books in the library, and nobody would tear them up. All the people who'd been scared and sad were happy again, and that made Maya's heart feel warm, like when you drink hot cocoa on a cold day. She thought about the little notebook under her mattress, the one full of dates and secrets. She didn't need it anymore, not for this fight, anyway. She'd used every page, every word, to catch the bad guys. It was like a treasure map she'd followed, step by step, until she found the prize, justice. That's a big word, but it's simple too. It means making things fair, making sure the good guys win and the bad guys lose. And that's what Maya did. She made Oakville fair again. The sky got darker, and stars started popping out, little twinkly lights saying hello. Down the street, kids were still playing, their voices loud and silly. "I'm Maya," one yelled, pretending to hold a badge. "You're under arrest," another shouted, chasing his friend. Maya heard them and almost laughed almost. She liked that they were having fun, pretending to be her. Maybe one day, those kids would grow up and be brave too, just like she was. That made her feel even better. People walked by her house, waving at her. "Hey, Maya," a man called, tipping his hat. "You're the best," a lady shouted, carrying a basket of apples from Mr. Jenkins's store. Maya waved back, small and quick, like she always did. She didn't need to say much, her actions said it all. She'd shown everyone that you don't have to be loud or big or fancy to make a difference. You just have to be you, and do what's right. So, what's the takeaway? What's the big lesson here? It's this: never judge someone by what you see on the outside. You know how you look at a present under the Christmas tree? It might be wrapped in plain paper, not shiny or sparkly, and you think, "Oh, that's probably boring." But then you open it, and wow, it's the coolest toy ever. People are like that too. The quiet ones, the ones who don't show off, might just be the strongest, the smartest, the bravest. Maya was proof of that. She didn't talk big or act tough, but she changed everything. Think about your own life for a second. Have you ever met someone who surprised you? Maybe a kid at school who seemed shy but turned out to be awesome at drawing. Or a teacher who looked boring but told the funniest stories. Or even a friend who didn't say much but helped you when you needed it most. Those are the Mayas of the world, the ones who don't shout about how great they are but show it when it counts. They're everywhere, hiding in plain sight, waiting for their moment. Maya walked inside her little house as the last bit of sunlight faded. She put her badge on the wobbly table and sat on her squeaky bed. The town outside was still noisy, happy noisy. She could hear Mrs. Carter yelling about free cookies, and kids singing their silly Maya Saved the Day song. It made her think about something else: being strong doesn't mean you have to fight with fists or yell loud. Sometimes, being strong means being patient, watching, listening, and waiting for the right time. That's what she did, and it worked. She remembered the bad guys laughing at her. "Keep scrubbing, sweetheart," Dan had said, sneering. "You're nothing," Harlan had added, waving his hand. They thought she was weak because she was quiet, because she mopped floors and poured coffee. But quiet doesn't mean weak. It can mean smart. It can mean sneaky. It can mean powerful. Maya was all those things, and she used them to win not just for herself, but for everyone in Oakville. The stars outside got brighter, and the town settled down a little. People went home, still talking about the big day. "Can you believe it?" a mom said to her kid. "Maya tricked them all." The kid nodded, holding a cookie from Mrs. Carter. "She's like a superhero," he said. And he was right. Maya was a superhero, but not the kind with a cape or laser eyes. She was the kind with a mop, a notebook, and a big heart. That's another takeaway: you don't need fancy stuff to be a hero. You don't need a costume or a magic wand. You just need to care, to try, to do what's right even when it's hard. Maya didn't have a big house or a shiny car. She had old clothes, a tiny home, and a job nobody thought was special. But she had courage, tons of it, and that's what made her unstoppable. You can be like that too. You don't have to be the loudest kid in class or the fastest runner. You just have to be you, and use what you've got to help others. Maya lay back on her bed, the springs squeaking loud. She looked at the ceiling, thinking about the past few months. All those nights mopping the courtroom, hearing the bad guys plan their tricks. All those days pouring coffee, listening to people whisper about how scared they were. She'd kept it all inside, like a secret treasure, until the perfect day came. And when it did, she didn't just win, she made everything better. That's what heroes do: they fix things, not for glory, but because it's right. Outside, the big oak tree swayed in the wind. It was still there, tall and strong, just like it had been forever. Oakville was named after that tree, and now it felt like the town was strong again too, not because of the tree, but because of Maya. She'd made it a place where kids could play, where people could smile, where bullies couldn't win. That's a big deal, and it all came from one quiet lady who didn't give up. So, what do you think? What's your takeaway? Maybe it's that quiet people can be powerful. Maybe it's that judging someone by their outside is silly, because the inside is what counts. Or maybe it's that doing what's right, even when it's hard, is worth it in the end. Maya's story shows all those things, and more. She didn't need a cape or a crown, she just needed herself, and that was enough. Have you got a story of your own? Maybe about someone who surprised you? Like a friend who seemed boring but turned out to be super fun? Or a grown-up who looked grumpy but helped you fix your bike? Share it below, I'd love to hear. Stories like that keep the conversation going, and they remind us that heroes are all around us, hiding in plain sight, just like Maya. The night got quiet, and Maya closed her eyes. The town was safe, the bad guys were gone, and she could rest at least for now. Oakville would never forget her, and maybe you won't either. She showed us that the quiet ones, the ones nobody notices, might just be the strongest of all. And those who think they're untouchable? They never see it coming. That's the magic of Maya, and it's a magic you can have too. Just be you, be brave, and watch what happens.